Mark had always believed that moving to Willow Creek Estates was the right decision. A quiet, picturesque neighborhood lined with towering oak trees and well-manicured lawns, it was the perfect place to start fresh. He had worked hard to get here, spending years in law school, climbing the legal ranks, and finally earning enough to afford a home in a community that promised peace and security. But none of it would have felt complete without Buddy, his loyal golden retriever, who had been by his side through thick and thin. Buddy wasn't just a pet. He was family, a service dog trained to sense Mark's anxiety, grounding him during the high-pressure demands of his profession. In return, Mark ensured Buddy had the best life possible, long walks, plenty of playtime, and a spot right at the foot of his bed every night. Life in Willow Creek felt idyllic until the letter arrived. It was an official notice from the Homeowners Association, HOA. Its words as cold and impersonal as a corporate rejection letter. Per HOA regulations, unauthorized dog breeds are prohibited in this community. Your dog does not meet the approved standards. You are required to remove the animal from the property within 14 days to avoid fines and legal action. Mark read the letter twice, then a third time. A sharp knot of confusion twisted in his gut. Unauthorized. That didn't make sense. Buddy wasn't some restricted breed. He was a golden retriever, one of the most common and widely accepted dogs in any neighborhood. But what set Buddy apart was his service dog certification, legally protecting him under the Americans with Disabilities Act ADA. Frowning, Mark set the letter down, rubbing his temples. This had to be some clerical error, an outdated rule, or a misunderstanding. He'd dealt with HOA disputes before as a lawyer, but he had never imagined he'd be on the receiving end of one. Still, he wasn't worried. A simple phone call, some legal clarification, and this whole thing would be sorted out. At least, that's what he thought. Because what Mark didn't realize was that this was only the beginning, and the HOA wasn't going to back down so easily. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. Mark wasn't the type to back down from a fight, especially not when he knew the law was on his side. The moment he received the HOA's notice, he drafted a firm but professional response, outlining Buddy's legal protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. He attached copies of Buddy's certification, case law references, and a clear warning: any attempt to forcibly remove my service dog will be met with legal action. He sent the email and waited. Days passed. At first, there was nothing. No reply, no acknowledgement. But then the retaliation began. A new notice arrived, this time citing violations Mark had never heard of before. His grass was too long, his trash cans weren't stored properly, and his fence height was non-compliant. Fines started piling up. $50, then $100, then $250. Each time he tried to dispute them, the HOA refused to engage, only sending automated responses demanding payment. Mark could feel it. This wasn't just bureaucracy. This was personal. And then Buddy disappeared. It happened on a quiet Saturday morning. Mark had let Buddy into the backyard like he always did, watching him trot around happily in the sun before stepping inside to grab a cup of coffee. 10 minutes. That was all it took. When Mark returned to call him in, Buddy was gone. Panic hit him like a fist to the chest. He called out, searched the entire yard, checked the gate. Still locked. No signs of digging, no loose boards. He sprinted through the neighborhood, calling Buddy's name, knocking on doors, but no one had seen anything. Mark's hands shook as he rushed back home and pulled up his security camera footage. His heart pounded as he scrolled through the timeline, and then he saw it. A white van. It pulled up in front of his house at 9:42 a.m. Two figures in dark uniforms stepped out, moving with quick precision. They disappeared behind the fence for less than a minute before re-emerging. One of them was holding Buddy. The other popped the van's side door open, and before Buddy could react, before he could bark or struggle, they shoved him inside. Then Mark saw it. The unmistakable blue HOA logo on the van's side. His blood ran cold. The HOA took his dog. Mark clenched his fists, his jaw tightening with rage. This wasn't about violating neighborhood rules. This was theft, and they had no idea who they were messing with. Mark sat at his desk, fists clenched, eyes fixed on the security footage looping on his screen. Every detail burned into his mind. The white van, the dark uniforms, the HOA logo glaring back at him like a smug grin. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to think like a lawyer. Panic wouldn't help Buddy. Evidence, action, pressure. That's what he needed. The first step was obvious. Call the police. Within an hour, an officer arrived at Mark's doorstep. He explained everything, from the threatening notices to the suspicious fines and finally, the footage of Buddy being taken. The officer watched the video carefully, nodding along, but when Mark pressed for immediate action, the response made his stomach turn. "We'll look into it, but if this was done under HOA authority, it might be a civil dispute rather than a criminal matter." Mark felt his jaw tighten. "A civil dispute? They stole my dog." "Sir, unless we can prove criminal intent, I have them on camera." The officer sighed, shifting his weight. "We'll question them, but if they claim they removed the dog under a policy, it might take time to sort out. If they deny involvement, we'd need a warrant to dig deeper." Mark's hands curled into fists. He could already see it playing out. The HOA would deny everything, bury any evidence, and hide behind legal loopholes. Fine. If they wanted to play legal games, they just picked the wrong opponent. Mark dove headfirst into the HOA bylaws, his lawyer instincts kicking in. He pored over every clause, every fine print detail, searching for loopholes. Hours passed, his desk cluttered with highlighted papers and open law books. Then he found it, a small vague clause buried deep in the HOA regulations. The board reserves the right to remove any unauthorized animals for the protection and well-being of the community. It was intentionally ambiguous, a legal gray area that could be twisted to justify almost anything. No specific process, no oversight, just a broad power grab disguised as a rule. That's how they were getting away with this. They weren't stealing dogs, they were removing them. As Mark was making notes, he heard a soft thud outside. He frowned, stepping to the door. His mailbox was slightly ajar. He reached inside and pulled out a plain white envelope. Unmarked. No. Stamp. No return address. He tore it open. Inside was a single slip of paper, typed in cold, emotionless print. "Stop fighting, or things will get worse." Mark felt a chill creep up his spine. He scanned the street, but no one was there. This wasn't just about Buddy anymore. This was a threat, and Mark had just declared war. Mark sat in his office, running through every possible scenario. He knew the HOA had taken Buddy. He had the footage, the threats, the loophole in their bylaws. But proving it in a way that forced action? That was the challenge. The police were dragging their feet. The HOA was stonewalling him, and time was slipping away. Then, a break. A knock at his door late one evening. When he opened it, he found Mrs. Alvarez, an elderly widow who lived 2 streets down. She glanced over her shoulder nervously before speaking in a low whisper. "I know where your dog is." Mark's pulse spiked. "What?" She hesitated. "It's the shelter, off Briarwood Road, run by an HOA board member. They say it's a rescue for strays, but I've seen too many pets go missing and end up there. No one ever gets them back." Mark's jaw tightened. This was exactly what he needed. "Thank you, Mrs. Alvarez." She gripped his wrist. "Be careful, Miko. These people. They think they're untouchable." The next morning, Mark changed his appearance. Nothing drastic, just a ball cap, a hoodie, something to make him look like an average guy and not a lawyer ready to burn their operation to the ground. He drove to the address Mrs. Alvarez gave him, a small fenced-in property on the edge of town. A modest sign out front read, "Briarwood Pet Rescue, helping strays find a home." He parked, taking a deep breath before walking in. If Buddy was here, he had to play this smart. Inside, a middle-aged woman in a crisp polo shirt greeted him with a practiced, almost robotic smile. "Welcome. Are you looking to adopt?" Mark nodded, forcing a hesitant smile. "Yeah, my dog passed away recently. I miss having a companion." The woman's expression softened. Whether from sympathy or just good salesmanship, he couldn't tell. Of course. We have plenty of loving dogs looking for homes. She led him past the front office and into the kennel area. The moment Mark stepped inside, his stomach dropped. Rows of cages lined the room, filled with anxious, confused dogs, many of them wearing collars with old tags still attached. These weren't strays. They were pets. And then he saw him. Buddy. He was in the far corner, curled up in a cage, his golden fur slightly dirty, but otherwise unharmed. His ears perked up at the sight of Mark, but he didn't bark. He just stared, as if he knew making a sound could ruin everything. Mark felt a wave of relief and fury crash over him at the same time. They had taken his dog, locked him in a cage, and he wasn't alone. Mark forced himself to stay calm, to think like a lawyer, not an angry dog owner. If he blew his cover now, he'd never get the proof he needed. He pulled out his phone, pretending to text, but in reality, he hit record. Slowly, subtly, he walked past the cages, capturing every single stolen pet, every tag, every name. Then he turned to the woman. "So how do you get the dogs?" She smiled, completely unaware she was incriminating herself. "Oh, some are strays, but others... Well, the HOA has strict rules about pets, you know. Sometimes people just aren't responsible enough, and we step in to help." Mark gritted his teeth, keeping his expression neutral. They weren't rescuing animals. They were taking them. He forced a nod. "That makes sense. Can I think about it and come back later?" "Of course," she chirped. "But don't wait too long. We rehome quickly." Mark turned to leave, his hands shaking with restrained rage. He had everything he needed: video proof, a confession, and Buddy's location. Now it was time to bring them down. Mark gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had everything: video evidence, a confession, Buddy's location, and proof that the HOA was running an illegal operation. Now it was time to make them pay. He pulled into the police station, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had been brushed off before. But this time, they couldn't ignore him. Mark stormed into the station, bypassing the front desk and heading straight for Detective Harris, the officer who had initially dismissed his case. The man barely had time to look up before Mark slammed a USB drive onto his desk. "Watch it. All of it." Harris sighed. But when he plugged in the drive and the footage began playing, his expression changed. The video showed everything: rows of stolen dogs, Buddy locked in a cage, the shelter worker casually admitting the HOA removed unapproved pets. Then came the real kicker: a list of registered pet owners cross-referenced with missing animal reports. Harris rubbed his face, exhaling sharply. This isn't just a civil dispute anymore. This is felony theft." Mark leaned forward. "And you have probable cause for a raid, right now." Harris didn't argue. He grabbed his radio, called for backup, and within minutes, the wheels were in motion. That evening, Mark stood outside the Briarwood shelter, watching as a fleet of police cars rolled up, sirens off but lights flashing. Officers poured out, guns holstered but hands ready. The woman at the front desk barely had time to react before officers pushed past her, spreading through the building. Dogs barked wildly, sensing the chaos, as police began opening cages and scanning tags. Mark stepped inside just as Buddy's cage swung open. The moment the door unlatched, Buddy leapt into Mark's arms, tail wagging furiously, whining with relief. "I got you, boy. You're safe now." Across the room, officers restrained the shelter workers, reading them their rights. "You can't do this," one of them shouted. "We were rescuing them." Mark turned, his voice like steel. "No, you were stealing them, and you're done." As the police rounded up evidence, an officer emerged from the back office holding a stack of folders and a laptop. He waved Detective Harris over, speaking in hushed tones. Harris's eyes widened. Then, without hesitation, he turned to his team. "Bring him in." Minutes later, Robert Langston, the HOA president himself, was dragged out in handcuffs. Mark felt a surge of satisfaction as Langston sputtered in outrage. "This is a mistake. I was just enforcing community policies." Harris held up one of the seized documents. "Really? Then explain why you've been selling these rescued pets to private buyers under fake adoption records?" Langston's face went pale. Mark shook his head. It was never about rules. It was about profit. And now, it's about prison. As Langston was shoved into a police car, Buddy sat at Mark's feet, finally safe. Justice had been served. But Mark wasn't done yet. The HOA was about to crumble. Mark knew the battle wasn't over yet. The police had shut down the illegal pet racket, arrested the HOA president, and rescued the stolen dogs. But the Homeowners Association itself wasn't going down without a fight. A week after the raid, a thick envelope arrived in Mark's mailbox. No return address, just a bold red stamp on the front. Urgent, community violation notice. Mark tore it open and skimmed the contents. His eyes narrowed. It was a list of fines and violations totaling over $10,000. Unapproved alterations to property, $2,000. Failure to maintain lawn within HOA guidelines, $1,500. Disruptive legal action against the community, $5,000. Public defamation of HOA board members, $2,000. Mark laughed out loud, a dry, humorless chuckle. This was their play? They were trying to fine him into submission, hoping he'd be too exhausted, or too broke, to keep fighting them in court. He picked up his phone and dialed. "This is Mark Bennett. I'd like to schedule a meeting with the HOA board." 2 days later, Mark walked into the HOA's conference room, a sleek, over-decorated space meant to intimidate homeowners. 3 remaining board members sat stiffly behind a long table, trying to mask their nervousness behind blank expressions. Mark didn't bother sitting. He tossed the violation notice onto the table and crossed his arms. "This is cute. Really, but you and I both know every charge here is fabricated." The chairwoman, a severe-looking woman in her 60s, gave a thin smile. "We are merely enforcing community policies, Mr. Bennett, and if you refuse to comply, we are within our rights to place a lien on your property." Mark raised an eyebrow. "A lien?" He pretended to consider it. "That's interesting, because I went through your bylaws last night and I found something fascinating." He pulled a printed document from his briefcase and slid it across the table. Section 12, subsection B. Any fines issued by the HOA must be based on a pre-existing board-approved policy and must not be applied retroactively. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Mark continued, his voice cold and steady. "Your disruptive legal action fine doesn't exist in any previous meeting minutes. Neither does public defamation of HOA board members. You invented these fines. That makes them legally unenforceable." The chairwoman's jaw tightened. "And then there's this." Mark pulled out another document. Section 9, subsection D. If more than 50% of the HOA board is removed or incapacitated due to criminal conduct, the HOA must be dissolved unless a new vote is held. He leaned in, letting the silence stretch. "Your president is in jail. 3 board members resigned. That leaves you outnumbered. You don't have the votes to continue operations. Which means—" He let the words sink in. The HOA was already dead. The chairwoman paled. She knew Mark was right. The room was thick with tension, but Mark didn't give them time to recover. "Here's how this is going to go. You will drop every single fine. You will formally dissolve this HOA, and you will never, ever harass another homeowner again." A long, bitter silence. Then, finally, "Fine." Mark smirked. "Good choice." As he walked out of the room, Buddy trotting happily beside him, he knew one thing for sure. The HOA had finally lost, and he had won. The courtroom was silent, the kind of hush that comes right before a storm. Mark sat at the plaintiff's table, fingers interlocked, Buddy lying calmly at his feet, completely unaware that today was about so much more than just winning. On the other side of the room, what remained of the HOA board sat stiffly, their lawyer desperately flipping through papers, looking for something, anything, to salvage their case. But Mark knew better. They had already lost. The judge cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. After reviewing the evidence, including video documentation, financial records, and eyewitness testimony, the court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mark Bennett. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The Homeowners Association acted unlawfully in the confiscation of service animals and other pets. Furthermore, the court finds that the HOA engaged in fraudulent financial practices and levied unjust fines against residents in violation of its own bylaws. Mark didn't move, but inside relief crashed over him like a tidal wave. The judge continued, "The HOA is hereby ordered to pay damages totaling $250,000 to affected homeowners. Furthermore, all stolen animals must be returned to their rightful owners immediately." Across the room, the remaining board members sagged in defeat. The HOA's lawyer whispered something, but it was clear. There was nothing left to argue. The gavel slammed down. Case closed. The fallout was swift and brutal. Mark made sure of it. The moment he stepped outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him, shoving microphones in his face. "Mr. Bennett, what's your response to today's ruling? How does it feel to take down an entire HOA?" Mark gave them exactly what they wanted. He laid everything out: the stolen pets, the fabricated fines, the corruption at the highest levels of the HOA. He named names, exposed bank transfers, and made sure every homeowner in the community knew the truth. By the time the news hit local headlines, the HOA was already imploding. Homeowners turned on them instantly. The same neighbors who had once ignored Mark's fight were now furious, demanding resignations, refunds, and in some cases, criminal charges. Within a week, the HOA had officially dissolved. Their office shut down. Their bylaws nullified. Their power gone. The night after the ruling, Mark sat on his front porch, a cold beer in hand, Buddy curled up beside him. For the first time in months, the neighborhood felt different, lighter. Then, something unexpected happened. One by one, his neighbors started showing up. Mrs. Alvarez brought a plate of homemade cookies. The couple from down the street, who had once avoided eye contact, shook his hand. Someone even brought fireworks. Before Mark knew it, his quiet front yard had turned into a full-blown block party. People laughed, shared stories, and, for the first time in years, actually felt like a community. Someone raised a glass. "To Mark, the guy who took on the HOA and won!" A cheer erupted. Mark just shook his head, laughing. He hadn't set out to be a hero. He just wanted his dog back. But in the end, he got something even better: justice. And a neighborhood that finally felt like home. The battle was over, and Mark had won. But even as the dust settled, he knew his fight hadn't just been about Buddy. It was about every family that had been bullied into silence, every pet that had been stolen under the guise of community standards, and every homeowner who had felt powerless against those who abused their authority. That was about to change. A month after the fall of the HOA, Mark stood outside what used to be the Briarwood Rescue Shelter. It was under new ownership now, transformed into something real, a legitimate, ethical rescue center. And today, Mark was taking home another dog. The small black and white border collie mix wagged his tail excitedly as Mark knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "You ready to come home, Buddy?" Buddy barked beside him as if giving his approval. The shelter volunteer smiled. "You're really taking two?" Mark grinned. "Why not? The house is big enough." But adopting another dog wasn't the only thing Mark had planned. With the settlement money he won from the lawsuit, Mark launched a non-profit foundation, one dedicated to helping homeowners fight back against corrupt HOAs, legal aid, advocacy, exposure of bad practices. He was giving people the tools to fight back. No one else would have to go through what he had. And just like that, a movement was born. Willow Creek Estates wasn't the same anymore. With the old HOA dismantled, new leadership stepped in. People who actually cared about the community. The ridiculous pet bans gone. The bogus fines? A thing of the past. Now, instead of threatening letters, homeowners got invites to neighborhood events. Instead of stolen pets, there was now a community dog park, one of the first new projects under the HOA's revised policies. People smiled more, talked more. For the first time, this place actually felt like home. One morning, as Mark sipped his coffee and watched Buddy and his new rescue, Scout, play in the yard, a headline popped up on his phone that made him laugh out loud. Former HOA, President sentenced to community service at local animal shelter. Mark nearly spilled his coffee. Robert Langston, the same man who had run the HOA like a dictatorship, who had kidnapped Buddy, who had tried to break him, was now being forced to clean kennels, feed dogs, and do everything in his power to help the same animals he once exploited. Mark shook his head, chuckling. Poetic justice. As the sun set over Willow Creek, Mark stretched out in his backyard. Buddy curled up beside him, Scout gnawing on a chew toy. For the first time in a long time, there was no looming battle, no threats in his mailbox, no one trying to take away what mattered most to him, just peace, and the undeniable proof that justice always wins. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.